Royal decay, the disturbing reality of Henry VIII's rotting legs and exploding royal coffin. The stench hit courtiers 3 rooms away. In the winter of 1546, servants at Whitehall Palace drew lots to determine who would have the misfortune of approaching England's king. The unfortunate soul would approach Henry VIII's chambers carrying perfumed handkerchiefs, knowing they would need them. What awaited inside was not the golden prince of Renaissance paintings, but a grotesque mountain of festering flesh that had once been the most powerful man in Europe. Henry VIII's legs were rotting, not metaphorically, literally decomposing while he still lived. Massive ulcers had opened across both limbs, weeping pus and necrotic tissue that no amount of medieval medicine could heal. The wounds had become so infected that pieces of blackened flesh would fall away as servants moved their king from room to room. Palace staff would follow behind with cloths, silently collecting the putrid remnants of royal decay that dropped onto the marble floors. This was the same man who had once dazzled European courts with his athletic prowess, his intellect, his charm. The Golden Prince, who could joust, hunt, compose music and debate theology with equal skill, had become something from a nightmare. At 400 pounds, with a 54-inch waist, Henry VIII was no longer a king. He was a walking corpse, held together by silk and fury. But the horror did not end with his death. Even in his final moments, Henry VIII would prove that his capacity for chaos extended beyond the grave. His corpse, swollen with the gases of internal decomposition, would literally explode during his funeral procession, spattering royal remains across the countryside and providing one final grotesque punctuation mark to a reign built on terror, paranoia, and decay. This is not the Henry VIII of romantic historical fiction. This is the disturbing reality of a monarch whose body became as corrupt as his soul, a king who rotted from the inside out, leaving behind a legacy written in pus, blood, and the screams of those who dared to serve him. Chapter 1. The Transformation of Flesh. The accident that changed everything happened on January 24th, 1536, during a joust at Greenwich Palace. Henry VIII, then 44 years old and still maintaining the illusion of athletic vigor, was thrown from his horse with such violence that he lay unconscious for 2 hours. Courtiers whispered prayers, certain their king was dead. When he finally awakened, those close to him noticed immediate changes, not just in his temperament, but in his very flesh. Within months, mysterious sores began appearing on Henry's legs. What started as small, seemingly insignificant wounds refused to heal. Palace physicians, terrified of suggesting their sovereign might be gravely ill, applied poultices of herbs and honey while privately exchanging worried glances. To criticize the king's health was treasonous. To acknowledge that the head of the Church of England might be suffering divine punishment was unthinkable. "Your Majesty's legs require attention," Dr. William Butts would whisper during private consultations, his voice barely audible even in the king's private chambers. Henry's response was always the same, a roar of rage that sent servants scurrying from the room. The king, who had once prided himself on his physical perfection, could not accept that his body was betraying him as dramatically as he had betrayed so many others. By 1540, the ulcers had become craters. Modern medical experts examining historical accounts believe Henry suffered from chronic venous insufficiency, possibly complicated by diabetes and what we now recognize as Cushing's syndrome. The combination was devastating. His legs swelled to enormous proportions, the skin stretched taut and shiny, barely containing the corruption beneath. The smell became legendary among palace staff. Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, recorded in his private letters that approaching the king required great fortitude of spirit and stronger fortitude of stomach. Servants would burn expensive incense continuously in the royal apartments, but nothing could mask the sweet, nauseating odor of rotting flesh that clung to Henry like an invisible crown. By 1545, chunks of necrotic tissue were falling away regularly. Palace seamsters had to redesign the king's clothing constantly, accommodating not just his ever-expanding girth, but the bandages that wrapped his putrefying limbs. His famous codpieces, once symbols of virility, now served primarily to distract from the horror occurring below. Court painters learned to focus on Henry's face and hands, avoiding any depiction of the lower extremities that had become sources of shame and revulsion. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical. Henry, who had once led tournaments and hunted wild boar, now required mechanical devices just to move from room to room. A specially designed chair with pulleys and wheels became his chariot, manned by servants who had grown accustomed to the grisly task of collecting bits of their monarch that fell away during transport. The king's physicians, bound by both professional duty and mortal terror, could only watch as their patient decomposed before their eyes. They prescribed everything from mercury treatments to applications of crushed pearls. But Henry's legs continued their relentless decay. By the winter of 1546, the wounds had become so extensive that courtiers claimed they could see bone through the rotting flesh. Chapter 2. The Architecture of Paranoia. As Henry's body decayed, his mind followed suit, constructing an elaborate fortress of suspicion that transformed England into a surveillance state centuries before such technology existed. The king, who had once trusted advisors and courtiers, now saw potential assassins in every shadow, poison in every meal, and conspiracy in every conversation. Sleep became his greatest enemy. Henry's bedchamber transformed into an arsenal with loaded crossbows positioned within arm's reach and multiple daggers hidden beneath his pillow. But even this wasn't enough. Armed guards stood watch inside his room throughout the night, their eyes never leaving their deteriorating sovereign. The King of England could not close his eyes without witnesses. So convinced was he that death would come in his most vulnerable moments. "They watch me sleep, but who watches them?" Henry would mutter to his personal secretary, William Paget, during their pre-dawn meetings. The question was not rhetorical. Henry had constructed a web of surveillance so complex that even he sometimes lost track of who was spying on whom. Courtiers found themselves reporting on other courtiers, servants informing on nobles, and nobles betraying servants. All in service of a king whose paranoia had become the organizing principle of his government. The royal palaces underwent extensive modifications to accommodate Henry's fears. Secret passages were carved through walls, not for romantic escapades but for emergency escapes. Spy holes were drilled throughout the buildings, allowing the king to observe his courtiers when they believed themselves unobserved. Hidden listening devices, primitive but effective arrangements of tubes and chambers, were installed in meeting rooms to capture private conversations. Meals became elaborate theatrical productions designed around the prevention of assassination. Every dish that reached Henry's table had been tasted by multiple servants, each waiting 30 minutes before the next could sample the food. The king was so convinced of imminent poisoning that even the salt and water underwent this ritual. Kitchen staff worked under armed guard, their every movement monitored by men whose sole job was preventing regicide through seasoning. The paranoia extended to his own children. Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth, still young women, found themselves under constant surveillance. Their letters were opened, their visitors questioned, their movements tracked. Henry had become so convinced that family bonds meant nothing that he treated his daughters as potential rebels who might claim his throne through force or subterfuge. Court life devolved into a psychological horror show where saying the wrong thing to the wrong person could result in execution. Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister and the architect of much of his domestic policy, found himself in the Tower of London partly because he had become too efficient at implementing the king's paranoid fantasies. Even efficiency had become suspicious in Henry's deteriorating mind. The Tower of London, that ancient symbol of royal power, became a revolving door for anyone unfortunate enough to attract the king's attention. Henry would order executions based on dreams, rumors, or simple gut feelings about someone's loyalty. The headsman's block ran red with the blood of men and women whose only crime was existing within the sphere of a madman's influence. Perhaps most disturbing was how Henry's paranoia infected his entire court. Nobles began spying on each other not out of loyalty to the crown, but out of simple survival instinct. Betraying a neighbor before being betrayed became a reasonable strategy in a kingdom where the king's suspicions could mean death for entire families. Chapter 3. The Wives Who Endured Hell. The 6 wives of Henry VIII did not merely face the executioner's axe. They endured psychological tortures that would have impressed medieval inquisitors. Each woman who entered marriage with the King of England found herself trapped in a web of manipulation, terror, and sadistic mind games that went far beyond simple marital discord. Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, spent her final years essentially imprisoned in damp, remote castles, forbidden from seeing her daughter Mary and slowly dying of what modern historians suspect was poisoning. Henry's cruelty toward her was methodical and calculated. He spread rumors about her mental state, denied her proper medical care, and intercepted her letters to family in Spain. When she finally died in 1536, alone and abandoned, Henry celebrated by wearing yellow, whether in mourning or joy, none dared ask. Anne Boleyn faced horrors that extended beyond her eventual beheading. Before her execution, Henry orchestrated an elaborate frame-up that forced her to watch as 5 men, including her own brother George, were tortured into confessing sexual relationships with her. The Queen was compelled to stand in the Tower courtyard as these innocent men were dragged to their deaths, knowing she would follow within hours. Henry's psychological torture was so complete that Anne reportedly thanked her executioner for using a sword rather than an axe, grateful for this small mercy. "I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you. For a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never," Anne declared before her death, words that historians now recognize as either supreme irony or the final psychological break of a woman driven beyond endurance. Jane Seymour, often portrayed as the lucky wife who died of natural causes, suffered her own unique torments. During her difficult labor with Prince Edward, Henry made it clear that the child's life mattered more than hers. When complications arose, royal physicians received explicit instructions to save the baby at any cost. Jane died not just from childbirth complications, but from the knowledge that her husband valued her only as a breeding vessel. Anne of Cleves escaped execution only by agreeing to participate in the fiction that her marriage had never been consummated. Henry forced her to sign documents declaring their union invalid while publicly praising his generosity in sparing her life. The psychological humiliation of being rejected so publicly, then forced to express gratitude for the rejection, demonstrated Henry's genius for emotional torture. Catherine Howard, barely 20 when she married the king, faced the most sadistic treatment of all. Henry's investigators didn't merely uncover her previous relationships, they forced her former lovers to describe intimate details under torture, then compelled her to listen to these confessions. The young queen was made to understand exactly how her past would be used to justify her death, turning her final weeks into a masterclass in psychological terrorism. Catherine Parr, the survivor, lived in constant terror that any intellectual curiosity or religious discussion might be construed as criticism of the king. She had watched 5 women before her navigate the treacherous waters of marriage to Henry VIII, knowing that intelligence, beauty, and devotion offered no protection against his murderous whims. Her survival came not from love or luck, but from an exhausting vigilance that required suppressing every natural human impulse. The most disturbing aspect of Henry's treatment of his wives was how he would shower them with affection and gifts one day, then ignore them or threaten them the next. This pattern of intermittent reinforcement, now recognized as a hallmark of abusive relationships, kept his wives in constant emotional turmoil, never knowing which version of their husband they would encounter. Each wife became a case study in how absolute power corrupts absolutely, and how marriage to a tyrant transforms love into a form of slow-motion execution, regardless of whether the final blow comes from an axe or from despair. Chapter 4. Gluttony as Madness. Henry VIII's relationship with food transcended mere gluttony and entered the realm of genuine madness. His daily consumption of approximately 5,000 calories would have been impressive for a manual laborer. For a man who could barely walk in his later years, it represented a form of slow-motion suicide played out on golden plates before audiences of terrified courtiers. The royal kitchens at Hampton Court employed over 200 people working in shifts around the clock to satisfy their master's appetite. The machinery of Henry's consumption was as elaborate as any military operation. Multiple cooking fires burning continuously, specialized chefs for different types of cuisine, and a complex hierarchy of servants whose sole purpose was keeping the king fed. The sound of chopping, roasting, and boiling never ceased, creating a constant audio backdrop of preparation for the next royal meal. A typical dinner for Henry VIII included an entire roasted pig, multiple whole chickens, several types of fish, mountains of bread, and enough wine to float a small boat. But the sheer quantity was only part of the horror. Henry had developed bizarre food rituals based on magical thinking that would have been disturbing in a peasant and were terrifying in a king who controlled the fate of millions. He believed that eating swan would make him more graceful despite weighing 400 pounds and requiring mechanical assistance to move. Massive quantities of venison, he was convinced, would improve his hunting abilities, though he hadn't successfully hunted anything in years. Oysters, consumed by the hundreds, would allegedly restore his sexual prowess, a cruel irony for a man whose rotting legs made any physical intimacy nauseating for all involved. "His Majesty requires the swan course," servants would whisper to the kitchen staff, knowing that this meant hours of preparation for a meal that would take Henry 4 hours to consume, while courtiers stood at attention, pretending not to notice the grotesque spectacle before them. The dining ritual itself had become a form of court entertainment more disturbing than any medieval execution. Henry ate in the Great Hall before hundreds of observers, turning every meal into a performance. The king would methodically work through course after course, while nobles watched in fascination and horror, forbidden to eat themselves until their sovereign had finished. These meals could last from noon until dusk, with Henry occasionally pausing to berate a servant or make a casual threat about someone's future. His paranoia extended into his eating habits in ways that transformed simple meals into elaborate security operations. Every piece of food was tasted by multiple servants, who then had to wait 30 minutes before Henry would touch anything. But his fear of poison had grown so extreme that he demanded different people taste the salt, the butter, the wine, and even the water. Meals became coordinated exercises involving dozens of potential martyrs to the king's appetite. Perhaps most disturbing was how Henry's eating had become disconnected from any sense of hunger or satisfaction. Court observers noted that he would continue consuming food long after any normal person would have stopped, seeming to eat not from appetite, but from some compulsive need to fill a void that no amount of food could satisfy. Physicians who dared suggest moderation found themselves quickly dismissed, or worse. The psychological aspects of Henry's gluttony revealed themselves in his food-hoarding behaviors. Despite having access to unlimited quantities of any food he desired, Henry would often demand that extra portions be brought to his chambers for later, creating stockpiles of rotting delicacies that servants would secretly dispose of. The king, who controlled England's wealth, was terrified of going hungry, as if his next meal might not come. His eating had become both symptom and cause of his physical and mental deterioration. Each massive meal accelerated the decay of his body while reinforcing the psychological patterns that had transformed a Renaissance prince into a grotesque parody of kingship, consuming everything around him while producing nothing but waste and terror. Chapter 5. Death's Final Spectacle. The end came slowly for Henry VIII, but not quietly. In his final weeks, the king had become such a grotesque spectacle that even his physicians, accustomed to medieval medical horrors, would leave his presence to vomit. His body had swollen to such proportions that his skin appeared stretched and translucent, barely containing the corruption within. The smell emanating from his rotting legs had become so overwhelming that incense burned continuously in his chambers, yet still could not mask the sweet stench of living death. Henry's final days were spent in a specially constructed chair that was less furniture than medical device. Pulleys and wheels allowed servants to move their king from room to room, though the process had become increasingly treacherous. Pieces of necrotic flesh would fall from his legs during transport, requiring servants to follow behind with cleaning cloths, silently collecting the remnants of England's sovereign. "The king requires movement to the council chamber," Thomas Cranmer would announce, and servants would steel themselves for the grisly task ahead. Moving Henry had become a coordinated operation involving multiple men and a tolerance for horrors that would have challenged professional morticians. On January 28, 1547, Henry VIII finally died, but his capacity for causing chaos was far from finished. His corpse presented immediate problems for those responsible for arranging a royal funeral. The body had become so swollen with gases from internal decomposition that it defied conventional burial preparation. Palace officials, terrified of the political implications of admitting their king had died in such a grotesque state, ordered the body wrapped in lead sheets and sealed within multiple wooden coffins. The funeral procession from London to Windsor Castle became the final act in Henry's theatre of horror. The massive coffin, reinforced with metal bands and weighing nearly half a ton, was loaded onto a specially constructed hearse and surrounded by grieving nobles who had no idea they were about to witness something unprecedented in royal history. Somewhere between London and Windsor, the inevitable occurred. The gases building within Henry's decomposing corpse reached a critical pressure. The lead wrapping burst with a sound that witnesses described as resembling cannon fire. The coffin exploded from within, and the putrid remains of England's king splattered across the interior of the funeral carriage and leaked onto the ground below. The procession ground to a halt as servants frantically attempted to contain the royal remains that had escaped their confines. Armed with buckets, rags, and iron stomachs, they collected what they could of their former sovereign, while the nobility stood at a distance, handkerchiefs pressed to their faces in shock and revulsion. Local accounts, suppressed for decades but preserved in church records, described dogs coming to investigate the commotion and reportedly licking the leaked remains of Henry VIII from the roadside. The king, who had claimed divine right to rule over England, ended as food for stray animals on a country road, a final grotesque punctuation mark to a reign built on terror and excess. Even burial proved challenging. The grave had to be dug extra wide to accommodate the massive coffin, but the soggy winter ground kept collapsing under the weight. Multiple attempts were required to get the king's remains into the earth and keep them there. Workers reported strange sounds and smells emanating from the burial site for months afterward, leading to whispers that Henry's corruption was so complete it continued even in death. The servants who handled Henry's corpse faced their own grim fate. Several died within weeks of the funeral, possibly from infections contracted while cleaning up the royal remains. Even in death, Henry VIII continued to claim victims among those unfortunate enough to serve him. Conclusion: the true horror of Henry VIII lies not in the dramatic executions or political upheavals that fill history books, but in the slow, relentless decay of both body and soul that transformed England's golden prince into a rotting tyrant whose very flesh rebelled against him. His story serves as a masterclass in how absolute power corrupts absolutely, and how the human body eventually reflects the corruption of the spirit it contains. The man who claimed to rule by divine right spent his final years as a prisoner of his own putrefying flesh, unable to walk, unable to trust, unable to find satisfaction in food, power, or human connection. His legs, rotting while he still lived, became perfect metaphors for a kingdom slowly poisoned by the paranoia and cruelty of its monarch. Even death could not contain the chaos he had spent a lifetime cultivating. His exploding corpse provided one final, horrifying reminder that some forms of corruption are too complete to be contained by any earthly means. Henry VIII's legacy extends beyond the Church of England, beyond his 6 wives, beyond the political transformation of Tudor England. He remains history's most perfect example of how power without restraint inevitably leads to decay, how the pursuit of absolute control ultimately results in the complete loss of humanity. His rotting legs and exploding coffin serve as eternal reminders that no amount of royal privilege can protect someone from the consequences of their own moral corruption.